Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Great to have so many people here interested and hopefully excited to learn about this project and the work that the Sanctuary Committee, Renovation Committee has been doing along with our designer, Mr. Paul Barabo. We're going to begin with a prayer, and then we're going to jump right into it. You have the sheets to whet your appetites and your interest, and everything that's on the sheet is going to be on the slides as well that you'll see on the TVs and the screen. But let's begin with a prayer. Gracious Lord, you have united us to yourself and to one another with your holy word that proclaims the message of Jesus Christ. And as a people now, we come together to worship you, to be fed by you, and to proclaim your name here in this community and around the world. That is at the heart of this project, Lord, that we would do those things to the best of our abilities, that we would offer you our best praise, that we would hear that word proclaimed to us in word and song clearly without obstruction, and that we also would then proclaim that to others. As we go through this, Lord, we pray that we remember the purpose for it, to give you glory, and also who we are. We are your children. We are brothers and sisters in Christ. Bless this discussion, Lord, to that end. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. With that, some of you were here for the presentation. Was it last August that you were here? I think it was about a year ago, and he is back, Mr. Paul Barabo.
Good morning. It's nice to be back with you. I was trying to recall when I was here exactly for the visioning. I'm also working with a sister church of yours in Prior Lake, and I know I was there in the middle of winter. You don't forget that when you're in Minnesota in winter. Nice to be here on a cool day and a bright day and with such great attendance. I'm going to move through what I have to present relatively quickly because I want to make sure that all of you have time to ask questions, but I'll try to be thorough as well. I'm going to start with those things that this congregation raised at the visioning that became, along with the leaders of your church providing input, and with my experience in working with WELS congregations and Christian congregations with architectural space. So, outside of the worship space, there were concerns for providing for parents that come to church, that there are places to be able to attend to children, and to provide some sort of monitor in the gathering space. I didn't note it here, but there was also a concern, as there is inside the worship, with the amount of light and glare in both of the spaces. In the worship, the concerns were for the acoustics in this space to promote the singing. Lutherans love to sing, and we want to make sure that we give you a space that you can do that fully. We also looked at improved lighting in the space, both artificial and natural light. One of the things that is challenging in your space are the sight lines to the chancel. We also looked at the need to maintain the seating count in this worship space, but at the same time allow for expansion of the chancel and to modify the seating for flexibility and to be able to see each other a little bit more during worship. And then, as I mentioned, really focusing on the glare that occurs in both this space and in the gathering space. With respect to the chancel, we've made provisions to improve the sight lines by raising and expanding the chancel space so that the top of the platform is higher. We've also looked at and are continuing to look at how we can strengthen the liturgical symbol in the space. And by that I mean those things that proclaim that you are a church of Christ and that you are a church of His Word and sacrament. We made considerations for improving then the sanctuary, the chancel steps, so that it could be. Sorry about that. I'm not sure why that's happening. So that it would be better for communion distribution, and also provide a format for the choir to be able to provide music as a part of the worship. In the balcony, we also considered how the balcony might modify at some point. I'm going to see if I can get that from continuing to change the image. Let's try putting it through here. So hopefully that will keep that from turning on and off. Sorry about that. So in the event that an organ with speakers replaces the organ with pipes in the balcony, we took a look at how the balcony might change. We looked at considerations for revising the rail and provisions for moving the control for AV to the balcony in the center of the space, and then to remove pews for better flexibility in the balcony as well. This is your existing existing main level of the building. I brought that in case we needed to refer back to it. And a blow-up of both the existing second level, this main level, as well as the existing balcony, just a little bit of a close-up image. And not knowing exactly where this presentation would take place, I did bring an image of the front of the worship, even though in this space that's a little less necessary. Some of you may not have seen it from the balcony. This is what it looks like. So firstly, I wanted to show you, we have minimal work that's recommended out in the gathering area of the building. Essentially, for provisions for parenting, we're putting a parenting room which would have a monitor where a nursing mother could nurse a child, and parents that need a temporary relief from having a child in worship would be able to go and with that child and be able to still see what's going on in worship. Of course, in the gathering space, if there is a monitor in that space, we would also have the ability to use that for temporary parenting in the gathering as well. A child that gets fussy, a parent could go back into the gathering space, tend to the child, and then come back into worship relatively easily. So it is essentially the storage room that is between the two classrooms over here that would get turned over for parenting. In the worship space, we are hoping to be able to scale back what was originally designed as the AV room, which doesn't function very well for being able to hear what's happening in the worship and thus control the sound. And instead, you'll see we're planning to have the full control for audiovisual and sound from the balcony. You can see that we've angled the seating to match the angle of the chancel. And we've provided the opportunity for flexible seating within the worship space in the front and some spaces in the center for wheelchair seating and also flexibility in the back. The challenge with measuring seating, code requires us to count seating at 18 inches per person. I haven't fit into 18 inches in quite some time. Most adults don't. Generally, I use 20 inches per person, and it becomes a benchmark. Some people like to sit generously. Some people squeeze together, particularly families will sit closer. The reason we use 20 inches is because these type of chairs are 20 inches, and so we can go back and forth between pews and chairs and not have the numbers change dramatically. But your existing space here, measured at 20 inches, we have 332 people. In the renovated space, we have 355. We're primarily gaining some seating in the balcony and in the far back corner when we remove the front portion of that storage room. In the balcony, as I said, we're looking at replacing the organ at some point with an organ that requires less costly maintenance, and can go to an organ that is the sound is provided with speakers. In doing so, the organ blower room in the back of the balcony can be removed. That's one of the ways that we pick up some additional seating. And the pews that are up there are replaced with the movable seating throughout the balcony. And we're locating the sound control and camera in the balcony and then retaining an organ console. The speaker organ still needs a console, the same as a pipe organ. And then we are proposing to modify the rail. Part of that, it's not a dramatic modification, but some of that is to be able to provide for acoustic treatment on the front of the balcony. Some years ago, Scott Rydell and Associates came in and did an analysis of the acoustics in this space and made a variety of recommendations. I'll talk a little more about that later in the presentation. The chancel is challenging in raising it, primarily because it is required to have accessibility to the chancel. So, as we raise one more level onto the chancel, we also have to make provisions for being able to maintain the accessibility onto the platform, and we didn't want to lose any of the chancel space, and in fact, we wanted to pull back the amount of space that on your existing chancel is devoted to the ramping that takes place on there now. So in raising the chancel, we've also raised or widened the lowest tread of the chancel, and that's so that right now, if you do communion across the front with people standing at tables, there's not a huge gulf between the person standing on the main level and the person standing on the top. When we go to three risers, there is a long distance from the top to the person standing at the base, and so it's very common to widen that lower riser or lower tread so that communion distribution can happen on that lowest level. In providing for accessibility then, we've essentially pulled back the storage area that flanks the north side. Actually, that's the west, I think, if I remember correctly. I was get mixed up a little bit here with your direction as I come in, but it's the west side. The storage room essentially is removed in order to be able to provide the ramp up right at the threshold where the current window is. That allows us to ramp up to a platform and then just a small amount of ramp that runs at the very back of the chancel space. And because symmetry is a consideration in the design of a worship space, we've also pulled back the sacristy. It means that we pick up a lot of additional usable space, partly because we get more in the sides of the chancel and we get more in the front of the chancel. So we pick up a lot more room to do things that are liturgical and to have a little more breathing room for the redesign of the furnishings, the altar, ambo, and font that are on the chancel as well. We've also taken a look at revising the back wall. I remember when I was here before, that is a conversation that has with it some passion because the existing mural has been here for a long amount of time. The challenge with the back walls right now of the chancel is the strong horizontal, the divide between the lower and the upper that doesn't allow for the liturgical symbol to maintain a great amount of grandeur, similar to what many other WELS churches do with cross within the space. The approach that we've taken to the back wall is to essentially build the lower wall all the way up to the ceiling and to be able to provide then a suitable backdrop for the development of liturgical symbol that is consistent with your theology and with your proclamation as being the Church of Christ, as a place of sacrament and proclamation of word. We've also, in that design of the backdrop, made provisions so that when you need to do projection in this space, that proclamation through technology can be done by projection onto angled walls that are white and high enough that they can be seen. If you ever become a church that uses technology and monitors, some churches do that now, some churches will never do that. But I always think as we design these spaces, we have to think for the future so that what you do in a first step with the chancel has value and longevity for the future. So even if you don't do projection as a part of your worship now, we have to consider how that can be done in a meaningful way without disrupting the symbol in the space. Part of the biggest challenge with the raising of the chancel is that this run right now is part of a required exit out of the space. So not only having to provide the ramp, but through the door in the back that leads to the stair, we also have to raise the upper platform of the stair so that it is the right height for the top of that ramp. That means adding 2 additional risers to that stair. So this is what the back of the chancel would look like, not with the dashed lines, of course. I'm showing this in 2 parts because the second part is not fully developed. The center of the platform, of the backdrop, is reserved for the development of cross and liturgical symbol. That has not been decided, which is why we're showing it in 2 parts. You can see there are angled areas over where the ramp comes out and the door to the sacristy, and those are designed to be able to either be projectable image when it needs to be on the drywall, or at any point that the monitor needs to be added to the chancel, that we have a place to be able to provide that. I'll talk about lighting later and some other features within the worship space, but we're retaining presence of font, ambo, and altar. We also are providing a wainscot on 2 sides of the chancel. It's simply painted wood that will blend in with the surrounding walls. The main reason for that is that part of the acoustic report required undulation of the wall on either side so that sound doesn't ricochet across the chancel, and that's where we start getting flutter echoes. You'll see later on, I'll talk about how we're dealing with that in the nave, because that's also an issue in the nave as well. And I'll remind the committee that we also have to have some of that undulation in what the design is for the back wall. That was also in the acoustic report. So enough animation to the wall that sound doesn't ricochet back and forth across the parallel surfaces on the back and parallel surfaces on the front. Now I'm going to show you the second part, but I want to be very clear. None of the images that I show you are currently being proposed. It's hard, though, to not show you the potential of the back wall without showing you what potential it has for developing symbol and art as a part of the space. So the next few slides, please don't read these as something that's being proposed. None of these images have been in front of the committee. There is continued work that will have to happen to develop the right liturgical symbol for your space. Oh, I thought it was the next slide. It's not. Sorry, I was going to show you what it looks like from kind of up in the air. Nobody ever sees it this way. But this image is helpful because it really shows you how much space is available on the platform. It's much more generous front to back, partly because the front edge is coming out a little bit, but more these half walls that right now are needed because of how far the ramp extends into the chancel. Those go away. They're significantly cut back so they don't come out any farther than the chairs for the pastors. So it increases the amount of usable space significantly. And this is not accurate to the choir. These are models just filling in temporarily so you can see the flexibility of the risers. They are designed so that all three levels of the front steps can be used to layer a choir in the space and keep them toward the center. And again, the overall view. So these are those images, and you can see part of what we're trying to do is allow for forward projection, so the projection wouldn't be there all the time, just when you need it. Some type of symbol of cross and liturgical art, and seasonal banners. So enough room that from season to season of the church year, you can still provide seasonal color and symbol and proclamation through art. Another option rendering, again, these have not gone to your committee, but it shows the potential. This one has some surrounding tile, art glass, and cross. Another image of potential backlit art glass and cross. And another image. Again, I don't know exactly what your committee will decide. The challenge with liturgical symbol is you want it to all be coordinated. So whatever happens with the presence of the altar, the design of an altar, an ambo, and a font, wants to echo into the cross as well in the front of the church. And then any supporting art wants to be designed in another way that's fruitful. Some of these images were actually borrowed from other WELS churches that we have done this type of combination of cross and art glass. And for those of you that always sit in the back, this is an image from the back. Partly we're providing this to assure people that if we do proclamation through technology in the space, that visual is still present for people that are under the balcony. So it's not high enough that projected image gets cut off. So let me talk a little bit about lighting. This space is a challenge with lighting, partly because the east exposure creates either a lot of direct sunlight that becomes too warm for people sitting on the east side of the church with the curtains. It was interesting this morning to sit and pay attention to the amount of sun that hits the curtains. It's actually moved a little bit off of the curtain now as the sun moves in the sky, but this morning, that was intense. Your existing lights, in and of themselves, have challenges with heat buildup, but additionally, in the space, which is not lit fully, look at the areas of your beautiful church deck that are really shadowed. It's particularly bad over by the choir, over in the back of the balcony, sorry. These lights seem overly bright because the rest of the space is darker than it ought to be. So what we're proposing is a combination of two lighting strategies. The first is to replace these existing globes with pendants that are designed with LED. LED is one of those lighting sources that easily dims So if there is a dimming package on the light, they can be modulated for both night and day to supplement either the presence of natural light or the absence of it. But additionally, we are also proposing some linear fixtures that are really small. Mostly those fixtures, they come in different sizes, but they're usually about 6 to 8 inches wide and a half an inch deep and have light that shines up as well as down. Some other fixtures actually reverse and have the deeper and the narrower. I believe that's what we're thinking here. What that enables us to do is to provide downlight more evenly across the nave seating in addition to the pendants. More importantly, the uplight can be designed to completely fill the deck on the top of the worship. The reason that's helpful is because, number one, it's a beautiful deck, and a lot of it is in shadow. But also, that light that evenly washes on the deck gets reflected down as ambient light, and it fills in the shade and shadow in this space. So overall, that lighting strategy will end up with crisper light in the nave and more beautiful lighting of one of the most beautiful features in this space, which is your deck. And of course, we'll have to supplement with spotlighting as well, similar to what you have, but very likely farther out into the space because the chancel will move farther out. For these side windows, most churches have to be concerned at some point with glare. Unless we orient our churches based on the natural light, there's often situations where we have glare from the east on a Sunday morning or midweek evening service, glare from the west. One of the ways that we often change that condition is with flexible shade. These are just examples from one manufacturer. The shade is designed to be pulled down or raised, so when you don't need to control the light from the outside, you can do that. But this shade is perforated. It's not like a shade that you find in most homes. And it can be perforated at a variety of different intensities. And the nice thing about it is it can cut the glare without becoming a light source. So when the sun hits these curtains, that curtain becomes the source of glare because it now is like a light. It's like the globe, right? There's a source behind the globe. And when that source is on, the fixture becomes the source. The same thing happens with frosted glass or white curtains. These type of screens come in a variety of different colors, mostly neutrals, but they allow the right amount of light to come through to not have the glare. And additionally, they allow the visibility out to see the outside. These curtains cut out the visual on both sides of the worship. The curtain cuts the light, but it also allows to see the surrounding world. The acoustic provisions in the space is probably one of the most critical things for a Christian worship, a place of Christian worship. So what we're doing is all recommended by the acoustic consultant that was hired quite a few years ago. Number one, the floor will become a hard surface. We're using an LVT. I believe that's what's budgeted. Mark, is that correct? LVT is budgeted here, not porcelain. Yeah. Sometimes we use porcelain. That's usually a higher cost. Where we have pews, the LVT works fine. It is essentially a vinyl product that comes in a variety of different options for stone look or wood look. Most people have seen it in commercial spaces. Hospitals particularly use LVT quite a lot. So the entire nave will be LVT. We are going to seal the deck. What that essentially does is it takes any of the gaps in the wood and fills those so the entire deck reflects sound rather than absorbs some sound. We are putting diffusion panels in the nave where I talked about the wainscot in the chancel to eliminate the echo that moves across the chancel space. We have to do the similar thing in the nave. We only need to do that on one side. And that's actually nice because if you notice, there's a lot of different size of windows on the west. And so we've chosen to do that on the east because the portions of solid wall are much more uniform. So we can do one design for an acoustic diffusion panel. Those will be in the areas in between the windows, and the entire walls of the worship will be skim coated so they no longer look like block. I'll show you an image of what those panels look like. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we will have acoustic diffusion panels on the front face of the balcony, and that's again to help reduce the pattern of echo that can happen from parallel surfaces on the front and the back. So if you look here, these are those diffusion panels. They simply have angles that create undulation in the wall, and they will blend in with the wall in color and texture, so that when the wall is skim coated and the panels are included on the east wall, they will be less visible. Those angles provide an uneven, undulating surface, so sound is not reflected directly perpendicular off the wall, but is diffused. That's why they're called diffusion panels. And then the panels that are on the back, on the front of the balcony, will be designed with color to fit in with the wood that's currently there. And right now we're showing a railing that is more visually transparent, so designed to remove some of the verticals so it feels less like a common utilitarian barrier. So again, the overall worship, you can see the panels, the pendants that provide that liturgical look, and the linear lights that provide the uplight and the downlight to cover and accentuate the ceiling. So we knew that this group, even without the liturgical design being finished, would need to understand the magnitude of the totality of what's being proposed. So the committee has looked at, in conversation with a local builder to understand cost, and this cost, so it's about $492,000. That is not a bid because we're not at the point of implementing a project or parts of a project. So this could be broken up into smaller steps. It includes hard construction, contingencies, any architectural and engineering fees that need to be provided for the approval of plans for construction, overhead costs and furnishings, things like pews and furnishings like the movable seating. The committee has also set a liturgical allowance. So any of the things that get developed in the front at the chancel, cross, altar, ambo, font, they have an allowance of $50,000 to $80,000 to be able to provide for the design and the fabrication of those furnishings. And then it is helpful, without knowing exactly when you will start any step in the process, to just understand some logistics for a time frame. Occasionally when I present to congregations, people are saying, are you going to have a shovel in the ground tomorrow? We're not anywhere close to that. When you approve whatever will go forward as a first step, whether it's the entirety of it or whether it's just a part of it, there is going to have to be a time period for documenting for the state what's being proposed. And that's generally, for the scope and scale here, about 3 months. That sometimes is longer if there's exterior work, because then you have other municipal entities to have to get approval from, but there's no exterior work here. There's nothing that would have to go through a board of zoning appeals or things like that that would lengthen that. So it's a relatively short time frame for the documentation. The construction, I don't have a number that came directly from a contractor, so I'm using some of my experience in working with church renovations of worship spaces and saying 4 to 5 months would be a comfortable range. Depending on the scope, that might even be 3 months. So it could be that it's undertaken during the summer, and during the regular school year, you're back in worship. The hard one to estimate is this middle. So those of you who are connected to construction or the design industry understand, or even in your personal lives, if the last couple years you ordered something for your kitchen, like a stove, and it took an exceptional amount of time to get it delivered. You pick it out and it takes time. The lead time on construction product, particularly things like lighting, is really long. It's unpredictable. I've had projects right after the pandemic that mechanical equipment took a year from the time that it was ordered to actually have it ready for going into a project. I don't know that first scope, and I don't know those specific lead times, but there's going to be something that will have to be ordered up front. Once you give approval, let's say it's the lighting, you might order the lighting 2 months before construction starts, so that when you tear apart your worship space to install new lighting, this space isn't sitting for 2 months torn apart waiting for the lights to show up. Most of the projects that have long lead time items don't start construction until those product have been purchased, and we know a set time for delivery, and then we back out what needs to happen in construction prior to the delivery. So this is the hard one to really estimate. I've said and I've talked with the leadership about could portions of this whole project be broken into smaller components, and that's certainly possible. The chancel and the changes to the chancel could be done as a separate project without changing really much of the seating. The seating and the lighting probably, and the finishing of walls probably needs to happen somewhat together. And the main reason for that is, in order to put up the lighting, the pews will have to be removed. So if you're going to remove the pews to do the lighting, you might as well replace the floor. You don't want to take the pews out, put them back, and later on take them out, replace the floor, and put them back. So there are components that naturally start to go together. Any of the work in the balcony is relatively easy to pull apart. Maybe a first step is just changing the seating to flexible seating, but the rail and the organ isn't changed right away. So there's always that potential to be able to be financially responsible as a congregation and not bite off more than what you can afford feasibly. And the project lends itself very well to that. Of course, the parenting and any changes in the gathering space can be done at any time. So with that, I'd like to open it up if you have questions. Things that we should discuss as a whole group, understanding that this is the first time you're seeing it, and there will very likely be things that will come up further down the road as you digest the proposal. Yes?
Are we able to continue using these pews?
So the game plan is, everything that you saw with the seating is using these pews, but reconfiguring them so that the shorter pews move differently. They just get angled. And then we supplement with chairs some of the pew areas where you don't have chairs now, but we're showing in the plan having chairs. Yes?
And also with the walls being changed, I deal with the banners. I don't see a place where the banners can go.
So the question is, if you couldn't hear, the new walls don't really have a lot of room for the existing banners because of the reconfiguration. It certainly is possible that the banners might be able to be used as a part of the center, depending on how the symbol gets configured. There's not a lot of option with what we can do with the walls, primarily because of the code requirement for the ramping to the chancel. And the bigger issue in the space is the sight lines. I again sat right a few feet in front of the balcony edge, and there is not great sight lines when seated, and when you stand, it's even worse. That extra riser will greatly facilitate being able to see more of what happens on the chancel. Part of the consideration for banners that are too large for whatever is then designed for symbol in the chancel space might be to use those in areas of the gathering where they also can proclaim as people come and go, and then banners would be designed for the new artistic setting in the front.
Do you have any idea how many we have?
I understand that I understand that churches that change the chancel space are going to have things and a lot of things that may need to change. It's certainly something that we should probably take a look at to see if there's any options for providing more flat surface. But to get the actual chancel space, it's fairly wide. Another option, and I believe we presented this to the committee, I have seen churches that rather than using banners on walls, use them on movable banner stands so that they can be moved. So if there isn't wall space, the banners can still be present in the worship space, but more flexible even within the chancel. A larger chancel gives more opportunity to bring those banners into the space and arrange them in a way that fits with the other liturgical elements. Yes?
I would like to share the history of the mural. The artist, Ira Pfeiffer, took himself as Moses at the foot of the cross. The characters in that display are congregation members that belonged here when that was made. I just wanted to share that so you know that that has a lot of meaning to the congregation.
So the comment, if you weren't able to hear that, is just a little bit of history on the significance and the attachment to that artwork. That the designer of the artwork, the painter, a designer of it, is reflected in Moses at the base of the image, and a lot of the original congregation members are also reflected in many of the images in the banner, or in the mural. It's been here a long time. I understand, as I said, that this is always a passionate thing for a congregation to wrestle with. And so the committee has made, so number one, at the visioning, we listened to the congregation. There's some people that have strong attachment to the mural. There are other people who had voices to say it shouldn't, it could no longer be present. But the committee has respected to some extent, both sides. In designing the front, we have not done anything to destroy the artwork. The front of the space is specifically designed to cover it, but not remove it or not damage it. And I think that's important, even though you can say, well, it's no longer visible. It still is an artifact of the history of the church, and it would be a shame to paint over it and not allow the congregation the option of having it at some point in the future being re-exposed. Stronger consideration that I think every church I've worked with that changes liturgical art in their space has to consider. And I understand the ties to the congregation and to you. And that's important. I'm not trying to diminish that. Every church needs to understand its roots and its history. But the church also moves forward and looks to the future. And that's really important, especially as you consider how new people come into the space. Those people that are not members of that tradition do not have the same kind of attachment to the artwork. That needs to be a strong part of your consideration as a church, because you really, in worship, are fulfilling the commitment that you have as Christians to expand the church and make new disciples and bring more people than just yourselves into God's family. I remember, I live in Milwaukee. I remember when I lived in Minnesota, I'm a good Norwegian Lutheran. I fit into most of the church art in many of our churches. But as the church diversifies, as more and more people of color become Lutheran, crossing my fingers that happens, that our denomination expands in breadth, those people need to also see themselves in the church story. The biggest challenge with murals that are tied to a specific history is it doesn't speak the same way to the future. I remember somebody in this group, or it may have been somebody outside the group, but the people I talked to a year ago, telling me that your school is much more diverse than what's represented in this art. And I understand from my own story, I respond very well to Norwegian-looking Jesuses. I have a lot of friends in Milwaukee who are not Norwegian, and they need to see themselves as a part of that biblical story as well. So again, there's no simple way to talk about this, but two things I think we have to make sure are always a part of the conversation. Number one, our love for each other and our charity toward each other. And secondly, this artwork, these walls, the furnishings, the carpet, are not the church. We are the church, and we are called to expand beyond who and what we are. That's the calling that we are, that we make as we fulfill our discipleship in the church. So those two things, the charity and our sense of mission and vision, have to be a part of that conversation. I wish there was a way to have both, because I think both are important. Yes.
I think I've been at this church since I was born, so that's 40 years, if anyone wants to know. And I think what comes to mind when I heard both sides, Alice, I think I watched that album, but this can be a both and. I don't think it has to be a two sides and somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. I think we can honor what was done, the intent behind it, the beauty behind it in the moment, and what it was shared and what it meant to many, many people, and honor what we're trying to move forward and do here. And I think that both things can happen. And while we might not see it, those memories and what that meant to Ottawa, what it means to so many here, both of those things can live in the same space. And I think that's important to remember too, that it doesn't have to be somebody's going to get some, I think it's beautiful for what it was and it's beautiful for what it will be. So I think they can both live together.
One of the things I suggested to the committee, and I don't remember if we talked about it at all during the visioning workshop, but I have had churches. I do this actually in my house. My attic is completely full. And so when I get things now, I photograph them, I document them, because at some point I know I'm not going to have that attic that can contain all those things, but I can go through and look at the images, document this art with a projection system out in the gathering space and in the front of the church. Those images can still be a present part of your worshiping community, a part of your website, to proclaim the heritage of where you've come from. So whatever we do, we don't want to lose that art as a part of your story, but we have to make it something that incorporates a new story for moving forward as a church. Yes?
Knowing the, for lack of a better word, the controversial idea of hiding this or not hiding it or not, a lot of the things you had up there were really interesting. Were there any designs with that still there? Or is it just kind of a foregone conclusion that that will be?
So we did not consider changes to the back of the chancel while still, so incorporating a new cross and liturgical furnishings. The challenge of that art has to do with the verticality of the space. This is something as a designer that I'm always concerned with in a church setting. There is a certain amount of vertical majesty that we want for our liturgical symbols, which needs to be the primary presence of proclamation. And the artwork divides that space vertically, and it also is incredibly intense on the top, and it makes what is on the bottom barren in contrast. So the hope is that with a new design that promotes a stronger presence of cross and more verticality, that it will all be designed to tone down the intensity so that the liturgical symbol can be front and center rather than the artwork that surrounds it. Yes?
Okay, so on those pictures you showed of the potential front, it appeared that you were proposing stained glass with the cross in front of the stained glass.
So let me say again, everything that you saw, nothing has been proposed. So it could be stained glass, right? It could be backlit stained glass. It could be texture. So we had some images that we kicked around that had tile pattern on the back, stone pattern on the back around the cross. Lots of different options that the church could consider. So
Where I was going with the question, do you have design options that do not involve destroying that mural?
we don't. And again, the reason primarily for that is because there is such disparity between what is on the bottom and what is on the top. We can't mute the artwork. And if we tried to pull that amount of busyness down onto the lower section of the wall, it now becomes even more of a distraction for the liturgical action at altar and at ambo. So it's a bit of a challenge because there's no way of unifying the bottom and the top without either having too much busyness in the front or covering up the artwork or toning down artwork in the front so that the liturgical symbol can become the primary image in the space. Yes.
I think where he's going with this is they would use a light box. They wouldn't go through the wall to make it a true, they would just build the wall and then put a light box behind it. You wouldn't go through the wall to natural light. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, if it's stained glass,
Yeah.
okay, then my assumption is that stained glass utilizes natural light.
No.
That's what I was asking. Do you have a design option that doesn't destroy the artwork?
So, yeah, the art glass that's being provided there is backlit with LED panel. That's usually the way we do it now. I've done it over the years a number of different ways with neon and fluorescent, and LED is actually perfect for backlighting stained glass. So right behind the art glass would be LED panels that could be turned on and dimmed or intensified to light the art without having to get natural light go directly back through the mural. So the mural stays intact. Yes?
It would be just like the face of Jesus. that-
Just like the face of Jesus. Yeah. Yes?
So the ramp in the chancel area will be like in the back of the chancel area?
So it starts.
But wait, no. So you would actually have a person that is in a wheelchair or a walker go like where that exit sign is, and then to the back, and then come out on the front of the chancel.
Right. Actually, I come out on the back of the chancel or the front, depending on where you call front and back.
And that's according to this picture here.
That's correct. Because a lot of the ramp moves to the side, rather than right now, the ramp starts at the back wall. So half the ramp is in the chancel and half the ramp, if I remember correctly, is in the back. Yes.
Do the furnishings on the altar need to be replaced? Is there anything wrong with what we've got?
So the question is, do the furnishings on the altar need to be replaced? Is there anything wrong with what you have? Wrong is a difficult word. I have worked with many churches that had a symbol like this. More and more of the congregations that do renovation look to furnishings that are a higher level of quality in the space. I don't mean to suggest that these aren't well crafted. I've worked with churches that had plywood altars, if you can imagine. They generally cover those with cloth so nobody sees them, but that's a preference. The reason that churches often consider modifying their liturgical symbol is to make them more consistent with theology and telling the symbolic story of the church. But if you said, so for instance, I have a church that is looking at a font that will have panels that will use biblical image carved into wood of various things involving water. Again, not every church does something a little differently. If this congregation said, we want to reuse these furnishings, it's not wrong. That's certainly within the right of the congregation to be able to retain those. But I think your committee is looking to say, how can we provide those primary symbol of sacrament and word in a way that is artful and is fashioned in a way consistent with the cross and everything that's done as a part of the backdrop. So again, it's not right or wrong. It's a matter of artistic preference. Yes?
Couple of comments. I strongly urge the committee to look at including some kind of a screen up in front. I'm a person that I have prisms in my glasses, so I got to take them off to see the Bolton in front of me. So I'm taking it off to see the Bolton, putting them back on to see the pastor, taking them off, putting them back. I mean, I get dizzy because I'm taking my glasses off so much. So please include a screen up there. Second comment is, this floor is a disaster. So, and I know Mike's on the committee, he knows this, but these pews will fall over if they're not attached. So we'll have people falling over and yanking them over. So they're all pinned to the floor. When we pinned them the last time, it was very, very difficult. So when you put this vinyl floor down, you have to have area for expansion and contraction and all that. So anyway, it's going to be difficult.
It's good to note, though, I mean, I've done this in a lot of churches, so it can be done. But it's good to note that that kind of care.
Yeah, when we tried to screw into this, it would blow out. It's concrete down below there. We tried shooting it with a powder-actuated gun. It blew out. So when we tried to drill through the carpet, of course, the carpet would pull up with it. But anyway, it's national.
This may be a question for the committee, but are we going to vote as a congregation and all of it or none of it? Are you going to set it up in phases or options, or how does the committee plan to address this to the congregation?
Has the committee talked about approval, how that happens?
We will be having a meeting here, I believe it's in 4 or 5 weeks, we're going to be able to discuss a little more in depth. And at that point, we can talk about phases, how we want to break it up, if we want to break it up. It's not going to be an all or nothing kind of thing. There's been a lot of questionnaires going out between now and then, kind of get the congregation's thoughts behind it before we just say, we're just going to do it all.
Yeah.
So there will be a lot more discussion before we get to that point.
I often, in the breadth of church work that I do, see the project broken into kind of 2 components. Number 1, is this the right vision? And then secondly, what needs to be first step, or what needs, how much can we feasibly afford to undertake? Both of those are completely different questions. The first one says, do we like the full direction? The second one says, what step are we going to take?
Yes. The school currently uses the storage area on the right, from our view, for the band and piano lessons. When that goes away, has the committee considered where, and there's storage also in here for that purpose, where that will be moved to?
So if I remember from the discussions, and pastors correct me if, or Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, part of the discussion was that there are other places in the building that we can find either storage or a place for the practice without taking prime real estate connected to the worship. I often have to consider an existing building's best use. Everything wants the place in the sun, and there's only so much room. So some of the conversation is finding other places, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there's a fair amount of space storage-wise on the lower level, and the room that's right in the corner behind the restrooms also has maybe some underutilized space there. Mark?
I wanted to call something out really quick. We have quite a few members on the Sanctuary Renovation Committee. If those members can stand up so everyone here can see who's actually on the committee. So if you have feedback or some other questions you have on it, you can actually raise it to the members on the committee. So those that are on the committee, if you can stand up real quick. And there's actually about 4 or 5 that aren't here this Sunday. But if you do have feedback at all, if you have questions, please reach out to one of us. We're going to have a form that's going to send out. But there will be a lot more conversation happening between this meeting and then the voters meeting in September.
Yes.
What's the plan to pay for it? Are you going to fundraise up front, or are you going to just plan to pay for it as we go, or what thoughts or considerations do you have?
Our past capital campaign, we actually have about $185,000 sitting right now in the bank, waiting to be used for a project like this. And then depending on what parts of it we take on, we would have to do some fundraising depending on how much we're going after. If it's a full kit and caboodle on it, half a million, yes, definitely have to do some fundraising for it. But we do have $185,000 sitting right now waiting to be used on sanctuary renovation.
If I could just piggyback on that last question, the way I like to think about things is, what's the desired outcome? We have all our needs or wants listed in the first slide, but what's really the desired outcome we want, and what's the priority for those desired outcomes? And then how do we proceed forward with what we can do or afford or borrow or whatever. So I would encourage the committee to come back. I'm not saying to do it that way, but to help understand and break this thing down. What are we really striving And I'll throw out two extremes. One, is it just a total redo of how it looks, or is it to improve sound? And how do we prioritize what we're desiring as outcomes for that? So.
I think that intentionality and clarity is always helpful. With that, let me just say thank you for the opportunity of serving the congregation. I have never been a part of worship space renovation that the process was easy. And it's not because it's difficult to design for. It's because this is your church home. You all have investment in this space and history. And the churches typically renovate over time. I'm always amazed when I look at old church projects and 100-year-old churches, and people say it's always been that way. And you look in the 100-year photograph evidence, and it's never always been that way. But we acclimate to the changes over time, and the church is a renewed church. Probably the hardest thing with a congregation of your age is that you still have kind of the first building that you built. But even here, you have evidence of an addition on this side and a school portion of building. So even though as a young congregation, you haven't had dramatic change in the worship space to wrestle with as a church before, it's not like nothing has ever changed here. So as you move forward, thank you again. Be kind and loving, and consider that you are the church. Ultimately, whatever you do ought to fulfill the proclamation of the gospel. That's number one. That's, if you're going to prioritize, please make that number one, to be the church. So thank you very much. And I will await further conversation with committee as needed. Pastor, anything else that needs to be said from the church's side?
I think just to clarify again, the information that goes out, we are looking to come back in over the next couple of weeks. And finally, for that meeting a month from now, it is simply to tell the committee, yes, this is the right direction. As it was pointed out many times, this is not a proposal, but after meeting for a year, the committee realizes we can't move forward anymore without the congregation saying, we like what we're seeing so far. We're not there yet, but this is the right direction to keep going. And if not, then we need to know to go back to the drawing board if that is the case. That's what's going to take place a month from now. Anything to add to that, Mark?
Nope, just be a lot of feedback form. There'll be crosstalk information, so pay attention to crosstalk. Links will be provided in there. We did the video of the actual presentation, so if you want to revisit something there, you'll be able to do that there as well. But pay attention to your emails and the crosstalk, so a lot of information will be in that for you.
All right. With that, we'll close with a prayer. Thank you, gracious Father, for a church of different people with different ideas, different thoughts, and yet we are all united to you. As we continue to move forward, strengthen that bond of love that we have for one another as we gather around Word and Sacrament. And again, we pray that as we work towards this, we work together, again, for the same goal, that the gospel may be proclaimed and that you may be glorified. Bless our upcoming week, Lord. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.